I alighted from the unmarked and stretched, squeezing those thoughts from my brain. The sun was warm if you sheltered out of the biting wind. I had not unloaded my thoughts of the moaning onto Sophie. If it were Shelley or Marge still being my partner, I think I would have burdened them with my paranoia. Sophs. She was a little too young to have to worry about these enormous loads. After a couple of years I may, if I remembered. I acknowledged Dr. Imran Hersey, who responded with a smile that was all teeth, dazzling white teeth. Morning, detectives. It's a little brisk, is it not? Yes. I nodded. Sophie smiled in response. No, Sophs was a little too young to have such a conversation, that all these necessary injections were slowly killing us, or at least making us males sterile. Could it be a world-wide action of females, as a response to being second-class citizens for the last 2 to 3 millennium? A thoughtful quandary to think about. Tea over a well-chosen bottle of red, an interesting conversation to liven up the meal we had just completed, and were chasing it away with a port of quality, and an excellent coffee before we contemplated opening another bottle of red. These types of conversations could lead anywhere, except a knife or a gun fired. We weren't like that, just a series of conversations that could, as I have said, lead anywhere if it was accompanied by laughter. Those were the best meals shared with Muscles, and his Mrs. Marge, my first partner when I was allocated a D role in the murder squad. How should we address you, Doctor? Out here in the field, Ian should do. In the office, Dr. Hersey would be preferred, yes. I nodded. Okay, Ian it is. What have you got for us this morning? An attractive young lady, a stab wound straight to the heart. Instrument used in the fatal assault? Yes. I have no idea at this stage except to say, the blade was quite long, and small in its sectional size. That will be examined further at the post-mortem stage to prove that point. An examination of the wound, which I suspect is deep, but a penetration hole, circular of around 5 to 8 millimeters across, killed instantly, as it looks as though the shaft of the implement passed right through her heart. The tip pierced the dermis of her back, breaking through the left scapula, a hard thing to do. It was obviously thrust into her body with considerable force, a difficult blow to manage. There are no signs of a 15 struggle, so the initial penetration was the killing blow. She may have reacted, but it was without any force. Killed within the last 18 hours, closer to 8 to 12 hours I'd say, but we'll narrow the time down when we autopsy her. Who discovered her? Hersey shook his head. Yes, a silly question, as the first on scene would be the officer to ask such a question. I nodded as I held up my hand in apology. Other forensic pathologists would have gleaned that information from who knows, but our new Dr. Hersey had a lot to learn yet. I walked out of the room looking for the first on-scene officer. She was sitting on a comfortable-looking outside settee on the front veranda that ran the width of the house. A light-weight aluminium add-on roofline that did not look out of place. It shaded the large window line of the lounge room from the western setting sun. Constable Shirley and Conrad's. Constable Conrad's out of the local station at Burwood. She stood and held out her hand. I shook her small soft hand, turning to introduce Detective Sophie Grasso. Not a handshake, which I found unsettling. A nod from each was their introduction. Yes, Detective, I was first on scene. The back and front doors were open, the house landline telephone was off the hook, and there was no evidence of forced entry. we received a Crime Stoppers call of a person lurking about the place. What time was this? Just after 6 this morning. The sun had not peeked over the horizon yet, it was still dark and bloody cold, no other information was given, and there wasn't an ID provided. Male, elderly, that's all. I was finishing my trawl of the near neighborhood ready to knock off. She glanced at her watch. I can see a double coming up. Please excuse me for sitting, but I am bloody exhausted. You say you were finishing your trawl of the neighborhood, any reason why? Yes, we've had a few BNEs, forced entries, and home invasions over the past month or two around this area. The number of patrols have doubled over the past month because of 16 pressure from the local inhabitants, and the local MP who happens to be the Minister for Police, and lives in the area. Not a friendly connection that should be ignored. Anything concrete, descriptions, you know, no. Nothing to hang your hat on, no. Family members. The young woman had taken up residence only recently. The elderly lady, the owner of the house, takes in domestic violence victims for a short period until the victim gets back on their feet or can be accommodated in a more suitable women's refuge shelter. The old girl, Doris Canto, she lives in a back room attached to the garage, leaving the 4 bedrooms and the entire house available for emergency use by women who have been ejected from the marital home. At present 3 of those bedrooms are vacant, no one else in the house. The owner of the house. Go around the back. I'll betcha she is sitting outside her granny flat enjoying the early morning sun, with a large mug of coffee. As long as you're out of the breeze it's quite warm. Doris Canto, that's the old girl's name. I cocked my head at Sophie to follow me around the back of the dwelling. Joe? Stephanie Albright is the victim's name. That's not her married name but her family name before she married. I've done a search on her, 4 avos out against her husband. The woman has changed addresses with her child 4 times, but the husband seems to know where she is every time, causes hassles, arguments, and an unsettling time for the one child, a boy of 6. Check to see whether she has a vehicle in her name. If she has, I'll lay a bet that the husband has placed a computer tag somewhere on the vehicle. Also, check on the husband's whereabouts and current home address for me. Here's our number 1 suspect, straight up. 17. Chapter 6. Mrs. C ain't who, is it? I asked of the woman who was napping in a chair, her head lolling to one side, her mouth open, the coffee mug she was holding spilling most of its content onto the grass. I cleared my throat hoping that would wake her. It did, as she slowly said. Sophie and me taking a chair either side of her at the end of the granny flat out of the chilly wind. The morning was dull, a low cloud cover adding to the feeling of mid-winter even though it was nigh on spring. Yes, she replied without opening her eyes or changing her position on the chair. You the cops who are going to investigate the death of poor Steph's. Go chase out her husband, he is a brute of a man, and has hounded Stephanie out of 4 safe refuge houses before she came here more or less as a last resort. Her little boy, 6 years of age, what a way to begin his life. It's a cruel world. Why would anyone want to bring kids into a world like this? I open my door for the overflow of the victims of abuse, mostly women, and their kids. People who are scared shitless of what their estranged partners are going to do to them when they find where they are now living. Avos aren't worth the trouble, they are only good for husbands who will abide by the avos' details as law-abiding people should. They ain't the bastards who will ignore the court document, it's the other bastards who will ignore every court decree, who will go ahead and kill the estranged wife, and sometimes the kids as well. There's gotta be a better way. She spoke in a whinging, whining way with no life or music in her presentation. An occasional sneer exposed itself. She spoke as though it was hard work to communicate, and I wondered why she had opened her home to battered women, speaking to them when they were at their lowest ebb, castigating the husbands at every opportunity, something most wives had done every day since their escape from an unhappy marriage and a dominating and manipulative husband. Despite these realizations, many of the women think they are at fault, and another go at marriage will be much better, but that tiger never changes its stripes. Mrs. Canto couldn't add anything more to the crime in the front bedroom of the house. We left her sitting there. I wondered if she would drift back to sleep. No, she got up and made herself another coffee before plopping back into the chair to slowly drift off again, losing most of her coffee again. I did my usual stroll through the house, though there was nothing of the deceased to try to turn the house, or at least the bedroom, into her space. Few clothes, mostly having a second-hand look, packed into an open, battered suitcase. The young boy's bed tucked into a corner, a cot missing the rails and slatted sides. His clothes clean and new. If he was well clothed, that was all the mother was concerned about, her appearance having little priority. 18, though her hair was recently cut and styled. Fresh nail polish on fingernails and toes. She was clean and had a slight pleasant scent. A threadbare oversized T-shirt, her night dress, could have been one of her estranged partner's T-shirts. I wondered where that thought had come from. I again spun around, taking everything within the room, committing it to memory. Is a smoker, or a person who is a heavy smoker, has been in this room? Sophie offered as she took a strong breath of air. Her nose pointed towards the ceiling. She repeatedly taking deep breaths, nodding to confirm her conclusion. I was still none the wiser. I shook my head as I couldn't smell the odor. I tilted my head to question Sophie's supposition. My dad was a heavy smoker. You'd never see him without a durry stuck out of the corner of his mouth. Lit or unlit. His pores used to ooze the smell, in his clothes, in his hair. She looked away from me, a momentary sadness in her eyes. As we strolled back to our unmarked, Sophie gave me the latest and current address of the estranged husband, Barton Fields. He had several strikes against him for not obeying court orders and avos, not a comforting thought. I glanced at my watch as I slumped into the front passenger seat. Computing the address into the GPS thingamajig to be given precise instructions how best to get from Burwood to Strathfield, one suburb over. How we easily get into the habit of not using our brain but instead rely on these GPS thingamajigs and Microsoft Spellcheck and Editor to get us through the day. Then again, I have seen reports prepared the old-fashioned way of writing or on typewriters, horrendous. You can see why computers were invented. Chapter 7. It wasn't hard to pick out what house we were looking for. 2 local DV vans, an ambulance, a morgue van, a forensic trace, and a forensic pathology van pointed it out for us. We added to the bottleneck in the street parking close to the cluster of vehicles. We made our way up to the front gate. Signing on with the crime scene register, I looked down the list of visitors. I scratched my neck wondering what we had walked into. 19 Dr. Breezelek came out the front door shucking out of her bio suit and 2 sets of latex gloves. tossing them into a nearby bin. Detectives, I didn't expect to see you here. A clear case of suicide, I nodded, thinking straight up that we had found the killer of Stephanie Albright, the estranged deceased wife of Barton Fields. Found dead with a single blow with some sort of knife penetrating her heart. The next suburb over. He takes his own life after killing his ex. It wasn't the first such case, and it wouldn't be the last. Zillock stood on the top step of the entry steps onto the front veranda. She seemed uncertain as to what to say. Our sudden appearance had thrown her. The deceased? Barton Fields. She ran her fingers through her short bob cut. He cut his wrists wide open while lying in a bath full of water. I can't give you a definite timeline, as I do not know the temperature of the bath water when he first immersed himself. Suffice to say that the water is now cold. 2 safety razors on the floor beside the bath. The closest I'll say to the time of the suicide is 12 to 14 hours ago, 8 to 10 o'clock last night. Geez, she took the last 2 steps to the front path. I need a holiday. I shook my head, frustrated with that outcome. Bree, we've just come from the halfway shelter house where your deceased male's estranged wife was killed sometime last night, stabbed, once. And you're thinking our deceased here was the culprit? Does the deed and come straight home to commit suicide, eh? A possibility, I guess, but it will need more than your gut instinct to prove your hypothesis. There's no signs of a struggle or another person involved, and there is a suicide note, Bree announced. There is no sign of a homicide here, Joe. Sorry to disappoint you, we would like to move the body out of here. Have you seen enough? I'll get one of my assistants to take the plug out of the bathtub pluggle, okay? The suicide note, I asked. I wanted to read it, slowly. The lead forensic trace person has it. Joe, it hasn't been signed, and the SFO cannot say for certain that the note was written and printed off this equipment, sorry. 20 I began to walk along the hallway with Sophie following me like a lovelorn puppy, almost colliding into Telly in a full bio suit. You've never looked more beautiful, my love, yeah, right. You need to see this. The one-page note was now safely enveloped in a clear plastic evidence sheath. The mother of the deceased has confirmed that while the note was prepared on a computer, and then spat out of an attached printer, it follows his speech tempo, and as you can see, it was addressed to his mother, she here. Teller nodded, pointing towards the rear of the house. I slowly read the note again before handing it to Sophie, as I headed towards the rear of the house. I stopped and returned to my wife's side. If it is a simple suicide, why the full bio suits? She shrugged her shoulders. For suicides it was usually a beanie, shoe covers and a set of latex gloves. Their gear this morning did not compute. The deceased's mother? She was the one who discovered her son, and called it in, a brave, stoic woman. The 50-something woman was sitting sipping on a mug of coffee, a look like the 1,000-yard stare that soldiers often suffered from after continued artillery barrages. Ishas Fields. I'm Detective Joseph Lind. My partner, Sophie Grasso. She nodded, glanced up at me, then settled on Sophie, giving her a tight, quick smile. I turned to Sophie, suggesting she ask the woman a few questions. Do you mind? I asked her. She shook her head. No, not at all. She seemed to come out of her daze quickly. Poor Barty, he couldn't carry the load that bitch of a wife piled onto him, and yes, I've read the note and confirmed it is my son's way of writing things. 21 You found your son? Sophie asked gently as she sat beside the older woman. Yes, not a sight a mother should see, she sniffled, swiped her nose with a balled up knot of tissues. Why were you visiting him? You live next street over, Regent Parade. I'd picked up Jason, Barty's 6-year-old son. He stayed with me and my husband last night, as Barty had a works thing on. I drove over this morning. Josh was excited at seeing his father. I called my Dave, my husband, Barty's father and Josh's grandfather to come and pick up Josh immediately. I pretended that Barry was taking a bath, and we'd have to wait for him to finish. I saw the note, she breathed deeply. He'd often spoken about going to Perth, or New Zealand, or Fiji, somewhere, just to get away from the garbage Stephanie sprouted. I've said to him several times that Josh was the most important person in his life, and if he disappeared then all Josh would be the things that his mother continually said about Barton. If he stayed and was a constant in Josh's life, then Josh would soon learn that his father was not the man described by his mother. She again sniffled, reefing a fresh tissue from a box of tissues she cradled in her lap to wipe her eyes and blow her nose. She then slowly took a sip of lukewarm coffee. Your son has numerous fines against his name for not abiding by the court-issued avos for him to stay away from his estranged wife. He continually ignored them. In fact, he was facing a jail term if he did not give up harassing his wife. Sophie was a little off with her facts, but it didn't seem to faze the middle-aged woman, who nodded several times. I glared at Sophie but then realized she may have found these facts out from her smartphone as we were in the house or walking here to the rear of the place. Women. They sure can multitask a lot better than us men. Your son, he was facing prison time, not a good choice for a 6-year-old boy to comprehend. The woman nodded sadly. Sounds like he is the stalker, the one who was the instigator, the one who ignored all the avos issued against him. Sophie was encouraging the woman to talk. Sounds like it, doesn't it? Barty would ring up Stephanie asking how he was supposed to pick up Josh for his week if he had to stay away from her place of residence, no closer than 500 meters. That's what every one of those avos stated. He suggested Stephanie take Josh to Macca's about halfway between their two addresses. Stephanie refused that suggestion, stating she wasn't traveling halfway around the state for him. You come and pick 22 up your son from here, she'd demanded. She then would give Barty her address. When he arrived there at the agreed time, there'd be no clothes, no toys, nothing for a week. She'd ring the cops as my son arrived, stating that her estranged husband was harassing her and ignoring the AVO conditions. The cops knew no better. They would read the conditions of the AVO and warn Barry he was in breach of a court order. A jail sentence could be the result. She shook her head. Caught between a rock and a hard place, all because of these mechanizations she organized. This happened at least half a dozen times. He was the one who ended up with red marks against his name. She moved 4 or 5 times for the same result. The court never heard his side of the story, or how he knew of Stephanie's address change. She had notified him of the change so he could pick up Josh. In the end, me or my husband would go pick up Josh. not an arrangement I cherished but... She tilted her head, raised her eyebrows. What else can you do? Young Jason would tell us after we picked him up that his mother was going ape shit as we were not supposed to pick young Jazz up. The judge had said his father was supposed to do that. His father had his son for a week on, a week off. Yes, we thought it a good idea when the suggestion was made, but there are no good ideas under these circumstances. His mother thinks little of Jason, and uses him at every turn to make it difficult for Barton. We live close to Jason's school, with his mother living about the same distance on the other side, but then she kept changing her address so it was difficult for Jason to continue at that school. All his friends, even street kids who were his friends, lived on our street. She shook her head as she began to sob. Again, wiping away the tears with a saturated balled-up tissues she held in her fist. Sophie sat back looking up at me. What could I say? I nodded, thanking the old girl for her time. A bummer, eh? Now both parents are dead, leaving little Jason's alone, Sophie murmured as we headed towards the unmarked. Chapter 8. Sophie went to turn the ignition key but paused and sat back in the driver's seat of the unmarked. I don't think Barton Fields killed his estranged wife, she stated as she looked over at me. Oh. Why not? I responded. 23 Stephanie Albright was killed by a single thrust that impaled her heart. That's not an angry assailant which you would expect from someone like Barton Fields after what he has endured. You know, he'd be as mad as a cut snake. He would have stabbed her several times out of sheer anger, multiple times in a frenzied attack, and secondly, he does not mention her at all in his suicide note. If he had killed her, in anger, he would have blamed her for everything wrong in the world, and in his world, she's not even mentioned, and he is sorry he has taken this last step, and apologizes to his mother who had pointed out several times that he needed to be around for his son's sake. That is not a murderer's reaction, but is the reactions of a man who keeps his mouth shut for his son's sake, and allows the shit hurled at him to fester, to build up to a point where he takes his own life, as that becomes the only solution he can muster, not killing his wife, which would have been abhorrent to him, I reckon. Another scenario is that he found out his ex-missus was dead. That could have sent him over the edge. I agree with everything you say except you convinced yourself that he is not responsible for his estranged wife's demise. He should still be the #1 suspect for that crime, and should not be discounted until a more suitable candidate comes forward. If one does suddenly appear, never discount a suspect for personal reasons, but you've done good though, girl. Well done. Keep thinking along those lines, and you'll do good. As she leaned over to turn the ignition key, she tittered. That doesn't leave us with any suspects for the killing of Stephanie Albright, no, and without a clue on which way we should progress. I sighed lethargically, wanting to be dropped back home to curl under the doona and sleep the rest of the day away. I wondered if I had contracted COVID. I'd had 2+2 booster shots, which would only dilute the severity of the virus, preventing me from dying or being a hospital patient, so they say, but I could still contract the virus and suffer lesser symptoms. I swiped my hand over my forehead, convincing myself I was near to dying. Us men can be such babies. Softs. Drive up to my place. I have a couple of rat packets to check whether I've picked up the virus. You think you have? I don't know, but I think I should check, just in case. I'm tired for no reason and have a splitting headache, sore joints, a dry cough, a dry and painful throat. I'll go via my place. That's closer. You can check there. I have a couple of rad packets. If you test positive, I've also got to 24 isolate, okay? I'm told it can be quite an experience, which has you lying in bed unable to do a bloody thing. My mum will come over to nurse me through it. You think that's a good idea? At her age? Not a good idea, eh? I'll just have to soldier through it. I leaned back in the front seat, and closed my eyes. I was becoming impatient with these cases. All the same but different. I pinched the bridge of my nose before commencing. We've got to check whether either one of the deceased was having an affair inside or outside the marriage, which could point us in the right direction. Where did Stephanie Albright's family live? We got a clue on that? No. We must have a talk with them when we find out their address. Chapter 9. Turn around. Sorry? What? Turn around. We have been derelict in not pressing Bartonfield's mother with more questions on her son's background, and she should know where her in-laws live, so turn around before her husband picks her up as she told us he would. Yeah, I found that a little strange. Stephanie Fields nee Albright did not provide where her family was as next of kin on that form she had to fill in when she first arrived at that refuge place, instead, supplying her ex-husband's address. I guess it happens more times than we think, a chasm with various members of the same family. You reckon that was all it was, a simple thing that grew into something larger that both parties could not climb over? I really don't know, Sofs. We might find out more with a more in-depth talk with Mrs. Fields and her husband. 25. We retraced our route to luckily catch Mrs. Fields about to sit in the family car her husband was driving. I instructed Sophie to pull up beside them, asking whether we could speak to both about their son's suspect suicide. The four of us once again climbed the front steps of the house to sink into the outdoor seating on the front veranda. Thanks for allowing us the time to talk. Where is the young bloke, your grandson? With my daughter's kids. He knows them well. I'll ask you the same question. Do either of you believe that your son committed suicide? Both were adamant in their response. Never. He'd not leave his son alone like that, even if he had killed Stephanie, which again I doubt he did. This was the response of most parents in a similar situation, a sense of denial to the obvious. Give me some background information. When did your son couple up with Stephanie? Kindergarten, Mrs. Fields offered after looking at her husband for confirmation. He nodded his assent. You see one, you saw the other, all the time. Plus 2 or 3 others who stayed best friends up until high school, and in a couple of instances are still best friends. Several of the gang went off to private schools which broke that life-long link. Yeah, Roberta Papadopoulos, she also was a close friend to Steph and Barty right through primary school. There were hints that her parents sent her to a Catholic high school to break up the friendships. They wanted their daughter to settle down with a nice Greek boy, who they had already selected. Still in Greece, she glanced out to the street as a young yahoo sped down the suburban road way too fast. I always said that Bobby, Roberta, and Barty were better suited. Together there was an aura, a feeling of love that emanated from both when they were together. Bobby was more settled than Stephanie. When Stephanie went on her 18-month tour of hitchhiking through Europe, Bobby and Barty just drifted together. I thought they would get together, but Bobby's parents were adamant about their daughter marrying a good Greek boy, which she did. After that, Steph's and Baz tied the knot. I always thought Barty went that way after Bobby married that Greek boy. They weren't in love and he seemed, over-possessive, and Bobby never looked happy when she 26 was with him. I don't have a clue where Roberta is now. The last I heard was that her parents moved to Cessnock as George Albright was hunted by one of the mining companies up there, but Bobby and her husband? I haven't a clue. She shook her head. George Albright? That's not exactly a good Greek name. Sophie offered. Yeah, I don't know. She shrugged her ignorance. There was a reference in your son's suicide note about his marriage, his wife not worth $2 bob, the only mention of his marriage or his wife. Could that have been an obtuse indication of his feelings for Bobby, Roberta? With your son thinking that Roberta was worth $2 of Stephanie? Sophie asked quietly. That's not how Barty would write a note. Sure, he wrote it, but it was under duress, I reckon. Mr. Fields commented. Mrs. Fields nodded. An obtuse mention of Bobby, whom I'm sure Baz thought he had missed the boat on. He said to me once that he had missed the boat with Bobby regardless of what her parents wanted for her. We have to agree with him. There was a... He stopped to wave away the thought. His wife patted him on the hand, giving him comfort. Chapter 10. What are you looking for, Joe? Sophie asked as she stood and turned several times looking at the bedroom. The second time that we had walked through Barty Field's unit. A double bed and a single bed half into a built-in cupboard to ensure there was walking space between the two beds. The boy's bed made, tidy with a pile of clothes neatly piled at the end of the bed, and on a chest of drawers on the opposite wall under a window. His father's bed a bit of a mess, with a pile of dirty clothes at the foot of the bed on the floor. Have you got any shots of the bathroom where Barton Fields allegedly committed suicide? I asked as I scrolled through what photos I had taken. Neither Sophs or I were that accurate or conscientious with crime scene shots at this site, as we knew it was a suicide matter, and out of our hands. Still, it pays to look at the little things, things that don't add up. 27 there. Sophie muttered as she handed me her iPhone. I scrolled up and down examining the few shots she had of the bathroom. I nodded as my suspicions were confirmed. Barton Field's clothes were neatly folded and stacked on the toilet seat. Look, I instructed Sophie as I handed back her phone. Yeah, I see what you mean. Where do we go from here if we now think it is not suicide but murder? I haven't a clue, but perhaps we should wait for the full post-mortem results before we start scouring across the countryside. Maybe we can find out where Roberta Bobby Papadopoulos now resides, without her Greek husband, huh? Chapter 11. We obtained the next of kin details of Stephanie Fields from Barton Fields' parents. They were a little unsure whether they were supplying the correct address, as it had been ages since they had conversed, during the funeral of Stephanie's father some years ago. One parent, her mother still alive and living in Lewisham. A younger sister who was married living at Abbotsford. Enough time to see the mother. Yeah, hang on. What about our COVID scare? Do you feel better? Worse? I feel okay now. We have something to do and the time to do it. Yeah, okay. We're spreading COVID far and wide, but what the heck, we're looking at a possible multiple homicide case here, figure in the GPS address so we can get going, and Abbotsford, close to home, eh? You can drop me there, take a SARS test and then continue home. There you go. The address was a semi-detached house which was one of many that lined the high side of the street. Early 30s, late 40s. Her house number showed the worst kept house in the street. You had to lift the front gate to open it, and the front path was a patchwork of weeds and broken colored tiles. A brass door knocker that got little work going on its burnishing. 28 But the brass letter opening in the door was used frequently going on its polished appearance. The door opened slowly and a tall woman stood before us cradling a baby on her hip. Yes. Unfriendly and cold. She looked at both of us as though we were Mormon or knockers wanting to save her soul if she joined up to the American cult. I showed her my ID card, as Sophie did the same. She appeared unimpressed. Coppers, what do you want with us? The child began to groan, which led to the child being bounced up and down on the woman's hip. Buggered if I could do that and remain standing upright. Mrs. Albright. No, that's my mother. What do you want with her? Again, there was no warmth shown, as though a past experience colored her opinion of us coppers. St. Fanny Fields, nee Albright. Your sister. Younger sister, yes. I hated these times, not knowing how to approach the subject, so it tended to be out there and blunt. Your younger sister has been found dead this morning. Under suspicious circumstances. At a halfway house, a women's refuge in Burwood. You say dead? That AO of a husband, I told her she needed to keep an eye out for him. I had bad vibes. He is also dead, Sophie countered. He's dead too. Killed. I won't shed tears over his death, but Steph deserved better. You better come inside, her tone mellowing, becoming warmer. The little one leaned towards Sophie as she passed, bringing a smile to Sophie and the mother. A bad sign, she going so easily to a copper. I'll have to watch her, as she normally isn't so forward or friendly with strangers. Like her mother, I thought as I glanced at Sophie. She was embarrassed by the baby taking notice of her. I thought that a little strange, as Sophs had not paid any attention to the bubs that I could perceive. 29 We were led into a small lounge room, which was really an alcove off the hallway. An elderly lady was sitting in a large sofa chair wrapped in a crocheted blanket. The TV was on but turned low. Yes, I heard. The old woman croaked, sounding a little impatient. Not the emotion I would have expected of her overhearing our conversation with her daughter. What happened? You don't know, do you, as that silly husband of hers is also dead? He didn't kill her, did he? He wasn't that kind of man. A good bloke who deserved better than my Steph. She was a whirlwind. Should never have married, as she wasn't the marrying type. Here, she lifted a bony finger from under the blanket. Shirley here is the mothering type, young Glenda is her fourth. She looked up at the woman still balancing the baby on her hip. You'll have to leave soon to pick up the other kids from play school. I looked around wondering where I could sit. There was no invites to do so. I was amazed at both women, having received the bad news of the death, not showing an ounce of sorrow or grief. The world kept revolving. How'd she die? The old girl eventually asked. I hope she didn't suffer is all. We're not sure as yet to the instrument, but it seems she may have died from a single stab wound, a concentrated effort. One wanted her dead. A cynicism in the words of the old lady. She harumphed as she defended her daughter, eventually. Mother? No use skirting around it, girl. Her father always said she'd end up being dead early in life, young Jason. Where's he? With her in-laws at present, Mr. and Mrs. Fields. Good. They are good people and I have no qualms of them taking over his life, best for him, as long as I can see him on occasions, yes. We have no say in that side of arrangements, but we can pass your wishes on to the right people. Good. Nothing else. She turned to her daughter who was still standing, bouncing the bubs on her hip. Can we rely on your hubby to organize her body? She asked. No, it was more of a demand to her daughter. I'd like her buried beside her father. He'd have wanted that, he was blinded by her youthful exuberance, and beauty giving her most of his attention. Shirley. 30 here. Even though the older of the two missed out on so much, she hardly knew her father. He was a stranger to her. I used to scold him at times, but it made no difference to how he treated the two, chalk and cheese. Chapter 12. Mr. Hegarty? That you? You've been missing in action for a while. You got yourself a dog, I see. How are you? He scolded himself for sounding too enthusiastic in seeing the old man again. To tell the truth, he had only realized the other bloke had gone missing when he laid eyes on him just then. The two elderly gentlemen were standing close to a street light that added a surreal element to their night-time image. A cold wind with the aroma of rain coming very soon scooted up the street. Their dogs did the usual hello of sniffs in rear-end places before they decided that neither dog was a competitor or a danger, a social interaction that highlighted how men, especially of an older age, cannot display emotions or want to be involved much the same as their dogs. Oh, that breeze is playing havoc with me arthritis, let me tell you. No, I've been in hospital, and recuperating at home. A couple of stents that were applied none too soon according to the heart specialist. I'm as good as can be at my age, let me tell you. A nasty business, so I heard, up the street while I was convalescing. I didn't know it was a women's refugee, did you? The two decided as if by telepathy to turn and begin to walk together down the street. The chilling wind at their backs. The two dogs straining at their leashes, but not tying either man in knots as they walked on either side of the footpath. About the farthest from each other without getting cold, wet paws from the dew on the nearby grass. Jason Hegarty shook his head. I don't know, if the woman had weathered the storm then maybe she'd still be alive. There's too much of this one strike and you're out mentality these days. He was violent, he swore at me, he raised his hand to me, maybe she deserved it, but there could be more to save than toss away at the slightest excuse. After the war, and yeah, even the Vietnam War, diggers came home out of step with society's accepted norms, wife bashing not uncommon then, but most fought through it to enjoy a peaceful life together, blaming the change to 31 their husbands on the war they had just survived, seeing terrible things and doing much the same. These wars have more to answer to as time passes. Broken marriages involving Vietnam vets is higher than the national average, doesn't that say something? And suicide in Diggers is also higher than the national average. It was obvious Stan Hunter did not agree with Hegarty's observations on social ills, and how to correct them, as he ignored the statistics provided. It's like this latest humdrum to quell the ever-growing whinging from some First Nations Australians. They want a separate voice in Parliament to represent them. Why? They've got the same as us now, their local federal and state member. Why should they get more representation? Hegarty completely ignored the logic presented by his fellow Nightwalker, and went off at a tangent, thinking his new line of thought was adding to the reasons why society was on a nose dive. They have the same rights and avenues of complaints as us, now, us as colonizers be buggered. We've been here for near on 250 years, we are not colonizers, our forefathers were, but from what I know, the powers to be in England considered this place not a place to colonize but to send out their criminals, petty and otherwise, as the prisons and prison ships were full to overflowing in Mother England, so these new settlers were mostly criminals themselves. Now I hear that several different Aboriginal groups do not want to be included in this one-man representation. They want an individual from their tribe to represent them in Parliament. Keep going and there'll be a tribe of one nation people being represented in the halls of Parliament, sitting in Parliament, and nothing would be achieved, as bickering and argument will be the day's experience in the Parliament, worse than it is today. Bugger 'em. They's got the same avenue of representation as us now, our local member, and that's good enough. That's democracy. A referendum be buggered, history has shown they are never successful. A total waste of money. And the whole sham. A racist idea, another tangent to concentrate on, Hunter thought. It would be a lot better if I walked alone with me dog. Lost in deep thought that I could control, not this quivering anti-society drivel. They had turned, beginning to stroll at an easy pace, as a vehicle's slow lie drove by. A station wagon. White in color. The windows blacked out so they couldn't see the occupants. Before Hegarty could start up again, on why the youths of today required blacked-out windows on their cars, Hunter turned the conversation to safer subjects. 32 All these weather events, drought, fire, mice plagues and floods, climate change, I reckon, bullshit. Hegarty responded angrily. Stan Hunter had thought he would be on safer ground when introducing this topic. He was very wrong and completely opposed Hegarty's solutions for the world's ills. The problem? Too many people on the earth. We need a decent nuclear war to at least halve the population, or decimate most of the northern hemisphere, no Chinese, no Indians, and the European continent including Russia. We should kill off 3/4 of the populations, and the Yanks, get rid of the lot of them, and we wouldn't have this business of climate change, or these new viruses popping up every time you turned around. Too many people on this planet, that's the cause of all these new ills, mark my words. This was not what Hunter wanted to hear, or remark on. He felt that if he opposed anything Hegarty said, it would get down to fisticuffs. He imagined two old blokes going hammer and tong in the middle of the street in the middle of the night. He could never see that happening, as he would run a mile to get away from such lunacy, but once upon a time, he could kill with 2 swipes of his hand. He knew what route Hegarty normally took on his nightly walks, and with fingers crossed, Hunter exclaimed he was getting a bad stitch, and was getting a little too cold, so would head for home. Another night, perhaps. Hegarty stated, sounding disappointed. Yes, surely, Hunter replied, hoping in that instance that the invitation would never be fulfilled. Chapter 13. I'm sorry, sir, if you wish to walk up the street to the shopping precinct, can I ask you to cross over the road? Yes, of course, Stan Hunter yielded. What's going on? Someone hurt? There was a plethora of official vehicles, all seeming to have their light bars strobing red and blue hues washing over all nearby surfaces. Nothing for you to be worried about, sir. Can I ask you to move along? 33. A slight bow, a toss of his hat, and the old gentleman stepped slowly from the pathway onto the bitumen surface of the road to cross to the other side. The old-fashioned mannerisms made the uniformed copper smile as he watched the old bloke walk carefully towards the shopping precinct further down the street. A dapper old bloke, the constable thought, watching him all the way until the old bloke turned to disappear around the corner to head for his favorite coffee cafe. Firstly, buying the morning paper that he would read cover to cover, obits included, he had nothing else to do with his time, and thoughts on why such a large contingent of coppers and official cars were present on his street didn't concern him. If someone had met a dreadful end, so be it, it was a part of living. He would not let it worry him, as if he did, that carefully constructed wall of security and safety would collapse. Chapter 14. Stan Hunter slowly sat with a sigh at his outdoor table and chair. He wondered how long this arrangement would exist if he failed to show for 1 or 2 days. There were no signs out signaling this table and chairs set were reserved for the old bloke, but it was always left for him. He wondered if he died tomorrow how long it would take another person to claim the position, with naught to show for his many months' reservations. He doffed his hat and smiled warmly at 2 attractive young mothers at an adjacent table to rid himself of those black thoughts. They weren't for him. More Jason Hegarty line of thought, God forbid. He wondered not for the first time how these young mothers could enjoy a coffee, a talk while they pushed a pram back and forth without missing a beat, while the family dog lay patiently at the woman's feet, the dog sitting beside her ignoring the humdrum of the cafe. His favorite young waitress came out, a smile her opening gambit. "Good morning, Stan." She welcomed the old bloke. "Another fine day, and they say we are in for more rain later this arvo," he nodded. Rain meant he stayed at home, his night walks would be curtailed. He didn't enjoy sloshing about huddled under an umbrella and not able to see where he was walking, and not knowing if anyone was lurking. Again, he scoffed at those thoughts, thinking they were more suitable for Jason Hegarty. What's going on down the street? Cops everywhere. I had to cross the street to get here. I thought they may make me walk around the block at one stage. There's police tape all over. 34. The place. Hunter commented before adding that he wished for his usual. That request had never changed. I don't care now for sure, but someone has died, being killed in the battered wives' refuge, so the whisper goes, your usual. She smiled, knowing that the order would never change. She a hive of information overheard at various tables, especially from those where older folks sat enjoying their usual morning habit, and whiling away the hours. A little shocked that someone so young had beaten all of them to that final earthly arrangement. He nodded before speaking again. That's a female refuge? For battered wives? I didn't know that. You rarely see anyone about. Yes, and there's a refuge of sorts down your street when there is a spill over effect from this address. That's where a young woman was killed the other day, at that place in your street. She nodded before she scurried away, checking other tables for orders before she disappeared into the dimly lit interior of the cafe. Stan Hunter nodded before turning his attention to the paper. The who-ha of police activity forgotten. Not even the knowledge imparted by his favorite waitress worrying him. The recent homicides forgotten quickly as he returned to the newspaper, while elderly women around him paid more attention to the recent death. That type of thing was excellent gossip material, and as time went by, they added to the weight of blather. Chapter 15. Connected. Sophie asked as she straightened, looking carefully around the room. I reckon, I replied thoughtfully. One stab straight to the heart, attractive woman, don't you think? So was the other victim in Harris Street the other day. One thrust with a long, bladed implement, straight to the heart from the front through the rib cage. Clinically affected, Sherish Azan, Indian. I reckon, we should put out an APB on her husband, but I reckon he'd be halfway to his hometown in India by now. 35 boss, this woman's death mirrors that of Stephanie Field's-Nee Albright of a couple of weeks ago, same mo exactly, the single thrust to the heart. I nodded, not really taking in Sophie's words. I was in a world of my own, complete or wide divorced from this scene. Her words coming to me through a long tunnel filled with cotton wool. Boss? You okay? I nodded, not knowing why I was nodding. Our culprit has a hate of women who have fled from the marital home, usually because of repeated incidents of cruelty, either economic, physical or psychological abuse, stated Sophie, pleased with her deductive reasoning. Yeah, I'll agree with you up to a point, but let's not set that theory in concrete yet. We have a way to go. Is there any connection with our two victims? What is the significance of the old bloke bashed to an inch of his life out in the front yard? Did he see anything? Could he recognize or identify our perps? What was the old bloke doing there in any case? Was he a peep creep? Looking through bedroom windows for a cheap thrill, I had landed again in full control of my faculties. He looked a bit old for that type of thrill. You reckon he could get his rocks off at his age? I doubt it. Supposedly there are men who are sexually active up to their 70s, 80s and 90s, yeah. What's the percentage? Sophie asked, a broad grin to challenge my theory. I ignored her comment as I looked around the room. Scratched my head before pulling at my right earlobe, a habit that usually showed I was not in step with the conclusions so far reached. The forensic trace team had already concluded that the perp came in through the open and unlocked window. I bent to look out through the window, seeing nothing of interest. A long veranda with a low roof lying over like the classic Australian farmhouse. The veranda tiled in a mosaic pattern popular in years. The architect couldn't see the silliness of designing a rambling farmhouse structure that was far better on acreage, several thousand acres. I scratched my head as I walked to the bedroom door that led onto a long hallway with similar doors either side. I walked down the hall, trying each door as I passed. Some were 36 locked, others not. I peered into those empty bedrooms, some occupied by sleeping women who had not woken to the sounds of our examination. Others were empty. Neatly presented. Clean and tidy. I counted 20 such rooms, 10 to each side of the corridor. Each with a small kitchenette with hot and cold water, an electric jug, and a mirror over the sink. A 25% vacancy rate, which I've felt went against the current thoughts that these women refugees were bursting at the seams. There was a large floor-to-ceiling window at one end of the corridor, the other end spilling into a large lounge/dining/activities room. I walked back up to the window that was two separate frames in a larger frame. Both frames slid easily up and down. A simple window lock that could be jemmied open using a penknife, or a metal blade of a thinness to slide up between both frames. I called for forensic trace to closely examine the frames and the lock to see whether they had been tampered with. Again, I requested a forensic officer to accompany me outside and around to the side of the house. This time Sophie followed, frowning, asking herself what the old bloke was up to. "Could you check all around this area, and right at the window frame, and check for fingerprints, please?" The fur nodded and went away to get her tackle box of tricks. "You reckon our perp came in through that window?" Sophs asked me as I squatted down, closely examining the meager grass growth and dirt areas on this side of the building. I nodded, acknowledging her question. "I don't think he came through the front window into victim's bedroom. He would have made too much noise forcing the window, and I spun around as I stood on the extreme end of the veranda. It's too open. There's a security light up near the front entry door, and those wall-mounted lights along the extent of the veranda are on motion sensors, so the only possible entry is through that floor-to-ceiling window at the end of the corridor. I'll bet it wasn't even latched shut, was half open to let the night air circulate through the building, the sashes closed by our perp as he left. I'll bet the deceased bedroom door was only latched, not locked. The women felt secure here. I think they will have to re-evaluate their security arrangements." I walked out to the concrete area that was the off-street parking area for the property. Two vehicles parked side by side, the bonnets cold, meaning they were parked here for some time, all night I supposed. A chalk outline of the old bloke who was bashed to an inch of his life gave a sad ending to a long life. His blood slowly soaking into the concrete surface of the parking area. I jiggled some loose change in my pocket and walked out onto the council footpath to look back at the building. There were 3 security cameras mounted on the building facade. They didn't record any activity, as the recording device in the office of the 37 establishment was broken, and there was a lack of funds to repair it. It wasn't the first time I had seen such a similar situation. The only thing that pointed to was that our perp was aware of the problem, which didn't help much. I carefully picked up a cigarette butt, with 2 biros, dropping it into an evidence bag that Sophie had opened. I sealed and signed and dated the outside of the small envelope, thinking that forensic trace had not done an extensive search of the building or surrounds. I'd hand over the file to the senior on site when I ran into her. Something clicked, a durry, a roll your own. When and why was this point important? I took the sample from my pocket, hoping it would confirm something, anything to me. It remained inert and silent. Whatever had clicked in my brain had left. "What's the responsibility code on this homicide?" I asked Sophie. She scrolled through her smartphone to supply it. "Give that to the chief for Will ya?" I handed her the evidence bag, after which I walked around the taped outline of where the old bloke had fallen, his face and head a mass of blood, so I was told. His prognosis not good because of his age, over 70, when things can be decidedly iffy. "What do you reckon?" I quietly asked my young partner, as she returned to my side. Do we have a name for the old bugger? Looking down at the blood stain that had reached its limit of spread. They don't think he'll survive. Yes, he had a wallet, one of the silly buggers who carried ID. It's a wonder his house hasn't been ransacked. What was his name? Jason Hegarty, lives by himself 2 streets over. His wife died early 2000s. He's known to the local coppers, as he has a habit of walking about the neighborhood in the middle of the night. Known to meet up with another insomniac Stan Hunter, and Harry Coombs, who live in this street or 1 street over but near the corner with Forest Grove, though there's hardly a forest down that way. Stan Hunter habitually goes to that cafe we were looking at last week. That old codger that we saw. Dressed to the nines. Bet that's Stan Hunter. I bet our Jason Hegarty saw something that our intruder, our perp, did not like. He left him for dead. He should have checked his status before he took off. It might bring the bastard down if we can get a word with Hegarty. In the meantime, I've seen enough. You? Me? Yeah, whatever. 38 good. Let's walk around the block to that cafe for a coffee, eh? Then we'll pay a visit to the deceased ex-partner if he's still about, and her parents. I've got the addresses from the office, as they are listed as next of kin, while the ex is listed as a hothead, and to be wary of him. He has a temper, and because of his native country and Islamic fundamentalism, believes he has been shamed by the missus walking out on him. We see this type of thing more often now that we are accepting more people from that area overseas. Chapter 16. Mr. Hunter, I surmised, as Sophie and I stood on the opposite side of his table. Just large enough to accommodate his coffee mug, a slice of toast on an oval plate, and this morning's newspaper folded in half. He looked up at me, squinting though he had dark sunglasses on. Do you mind if we sit to ask you a few questions? I asked as I sat, not waiting for his approval. Sophie noisily scrapped a chair from a neighboring table to also sit opposite the old bloke. She smiled as the old bloke looked flustered. We both showed him our ID cards, waiting for him to nod before putting them away. A few questions if we may, I repeated. The attractive waitress fluttered about, taking our order of a mug of coffee for me, and iced tea for Sophie. We waited until she had disappeared into the gloom of the cafe behind us before continuing. A beautiful day to sit in the sun to enjoy your favorite ground beans. The old bloke shifted his gaze from me over to Sophie. He looked at her for ages before uttering a word. You're quite attractive, young lady. Too pretty to be in the cop force. He doffed his hat at her. Smiled at her while nodding. Sophie took the reins as he was enthralled by her presence. You take a walk each night, around the block, with your dog. It wasn't a question. Sophie ignored the thinly veiled pick-up line. I thought he meant little by it, just an innocent try line. He again nodded slowly as he stared at her. Taking in her features, exploring every line and beauty point, yes, she was attractive in a soft feminine 39 manner, a veiled softness that hid a hard interior. She had topped her class at the police academy in self-defense and attack modes. The old bloke guessed this, one combatant to another. The local constabulary have stopped on occasion to make sure you were okay, again, not a question. He again nodded. This time he replied in a gentle voice. I can't sleep all night. I seem to sleep in blocks of 4, 5 hours. It's a waste of time trying to get back to sleep, and I hate taking anything for it. A slow walk around the block a couple of times with me dog settles me down again, not every night, but most. Since me missus died I've found it harder to sleep all night. When she was alive, I'd get up to watch a bit of telly, now, I take me dog for a walk. What type of dog is it? Sophie asked as though she was really interested in the reply. Sydney Silky, had them for years. Me missus loved them. Old Benny will be the last in a long line, in dog terms, he's about the same age as me, late 70s. He chuckled. He's growing old faster than me, another chuckle. I sensed it was one of those favorites he would say to lighten any moment. You don't bring him out when you come here each day, again, hardly a question. If he had been a little quicker he would have realized the cops had been watching him. As it was, the comment went over his head. No, too many people, he'd get distracted and could snap at someone's heels, then I'd be in the poo. They'd not let me sit here anymore. A sudden shrill cackle from a group of old women broke the tempo. They were seated together some tables away. Bloody old crones, he complained. Worst thing ever to permit them to sit out here. I've complained to the management on several occasions, but it matters little as they still congregate here on most days, when the weather is agreeable. The younger women seem to talk a little softer as you rarely pick up their conversation. Sophie nodded. Smiled. Your mate Jason Hegarty, the old bloke blinked hard as he looked at Sophie then across at me. 40, hardly a mate, more a fellow insomniac who often walks the streets in the middle of the night like me. If we catch up it's because we're going in the same direction, but no, I wouldn't call him a mate of mine. He's been in hospital having a couple of stents inserted, has only just begun to walk the streets at night again. I ran into him last night, he was in fine form. His old self again. Cynical, obdurate, and still listing conspiracies. The one good thing, he got himself a dog to accompany him on his midnight walks. Does that happen often? You know, you walking with him? Too often for my liking. He's a cantankerous character who can easily rile a person. He's got some argumentative ways that some people would find uncomfortable. When did you see him last? As I said, last night. His caustic tongue didn't thrill me much, so I said I was heading for home. A little too cold for me, I said. Yeah, about 1:30 this morning. He kept on walking while I headed for home. Would you know of anyone who would want to harm him? What's happened? Has he been hurt? When? Would there be any reason why someone would want to hurt him? You ask the questions, a detective. Who would want to hurt him? Good, I don't know. I guess anyone who had opposing views to him, or wasn't that taken by his opinions, any conservative middle-class idiot who thinks violence is the only way to treat these far-right fascists. That excludes me. Why do you think you would be excluded? Look at me. I hobble around with the aid of a walking stick, find it hard to get out of bed each morning without taking a breather between the bed and the floor, and I am a pacifist. I detest violence in any form. I've seen too much of it in my lifetime. Anyone you know? A fellow insomniac who would balk at the man's far-flung theories? Has Hegarty been bashed to an inch of his life? Has he been hurt? Was it him who was hurt last night? sometime after I left him, around 1:30, no, closer to 2. I guess he had it coming. His views seemed to harden after his wife died. I once thought he voiced those opinions merely to start a conversation, now I'm not so sure. 41. Why is that, Mr. Hunter? The old man nodded slowly before picking up his coffee mug. His paper lay forgotten, folded in half on the tiny table. He did not elaborate. He was assaulted sometime last night, in front of the women's refuge in your street, severely beaten with a walking stick such as yours, so we think, the heavy handle doing most of the damage. He missed the fact we knew where he lived. Is he already GHT? An old bloke, it's an unknown how he will recuperate, or not. If not, we are looking at a murder charge for our felon, ha. I think your felon should be given a reward for getting rid of vermin, near the women's refuge you say. He saw something that he shouldn't, and my street. He usually doesn't walk that way, although he had voiced the opinion such an establishment should not be in existence. If women are accosted inside their marriage, it is because they have done something wrong, or not done something right. That should give you a gist of the man, intelligent but insanely stupid. His blood pressure had risen, going on the ruddiness of his complexion. I was surprised at the emotion shown, especially from a self-confessed pacifist. I wasn't easily accepting that of the man. His dog? Ha. I was surprised at his choice. A little pug, all black with a light brown flash on his chest, a male. I don't rightly know. Has the dog gone missing? What was it named? Herman, Helmet, no, Herman. Suited him? 42. Yes, while Hegarty still had the dog leash in his hand, the dog had gone, run a mile scared shitless, I reckon. Chapter 17. What do you think? Sophie asked as she inched out into traffic. He makes my nose itch, is all I said as I belted up. It's almost spring, boss. Hay fever, I bet. More than a funny feeling about the man, it ain't a funny feeling, and I don't get hay fever. I want to do a complete background check on the man when we get back to the office. We've seen him before walking to that coffee joint without a walking stick, quite an elaborate one, eh? You notice it, from the oldie country I bet, though he didn't have an accent. He seems super confident, so cool, no worries, a smirk as though he knows something we don't. Most people we interview show some emotion, some nervousness. He's as cool as a cucumber. I didn't notice it. I failed to see how this is helping with our second women's refuge victim. I don't know either, but I'm going on the assumption that the old bloke's assault on the women's refuge property wasn't a coincidence. He was there for a reason. If we can line up the dots on that assault, I reckon we'll find the reason for these two homicides of those women, their estranged husbands. Maybe that half-smoked dairy you found will give us something, DNA at least. Here's hoping. It might have nothing to do with either crime, we'll see. Chapter 18. Detective Lind. Carmen Carmody from Forensic Sciences. Sorry this has taken so long, but our numbers have halved, what with the latest COVID strain doing the rounds. We are extremely short-staffed. 43. I nodded, wanting her to get to the point, and not ramble on with excuses why their report was so late. The victim? Who knows until she mentions it. I knew Forensic Sciences had been hit bad as telly. My wife had been in isolation for the past 7 days. She was due back on deck 2 day, but I doubt she will surface. She was that bad this morning. It was touch and go for me to ring for an ambulance. I had felt a little guilty, thinking I may have passed the virus on to her, and she then passed it on to her colleagues before she was aware she had COVID. It is more prevalent now than before when it first hit, with governments closing off entire economies. Now you rarely hear anything about it except to have the death figures advertised. Most fatalities are in old people over 65, 70. Barton Graham Fields, aged 34. Allegedly committed suicide 3 weeks ago on the 9th. Sorry to interrupt, but that case is not ours. Allegedly the chap committed suicide. You need to speak to the local chaps. They would be handling the case. Yes, sorry detective, but the case will be turned over to you as soon as the official forensic report is added to the pathology and blood workups. Together they will be transferred to the murder squad as a suspect homicide matter, as you were the most senior person on site at the time of discovery of the body. We will be coming to you. I groaned as I nodded, understanding THE protocol. Another case to add to the expanding number that I just seemed to accumulate. Okay, I understand. What makes you think it is homicide? Firstly, fingerprints. Unknown origin fingerprints were found on the computer mouse, certain sections of the keyboard, the printer, and on the printer paper. These prints overplayed other fingerprints. Most were of our victims. I am confident our victim did not write that alleged suicide note. Those same fingerprints found on various surfaces in the kitchen and on an almost empty bottle of barbiturates. Our victim had a high count of barbiturates in his system. Enough to make you suspicious of him being capable of undressing himself, carefully folding his clothes, and placing them tidily on the closed toilet seat, and then waiting for the bathtub to fill with water, and then cutting his wrists in a manner that is the most effective, that is, laterally down the length of the lower arm. Most persons hack away at their wrists crossways until they find the major vein. His arms were cut by a person with some medical experience, and not by a person who was intent on dying. When that is the case, the incision is all over the place, not as a perfect straight incision lying down the lower arm, the wrist. The assailant took care. If it were suicide, that person would not care a damn about the cut being so correct, so straight, and not ragged, or being deep or not so deep. 44. That comment made me sit up, think, and take note. Someone else had made a similar comment. When, and what about? Sounds like a homicide killing to me, officer. Anything else to make it easier for us? No, but the full forensic pathology, blood workups, and forensic trace reports will be available to you next week or the week after. We have sent a forensic trace team back to the premises to treat the crime scene as a homicide investigation, which, as you know, is a far greater exhaustive examination of the entire house and surrounds. Until then, detective. I had Sophie wheel her chair around to face me as I filled her in on the findings. She nodded energetically as she informed me that she had been suspicious of the suicide findings. Easy as in hindsight, I muttered to her, which cleaved her enthusiasm. Chapter 19. The rest of the week we were in court, so there was little progress of our cases. Another added to the 2 estranged women killed in the 2 women's refuge premises. Connected? I didn't have a clue, but until something came up that stuffed that assumption, we would ride with our supposition. It was a typical Monday morning where those who could crammed into the boss's office for our habitual staff meeting. It was there that we learned that the old bugger, Jason Hegarty, who had been badly assaulted outside the women's refuge, had died over the weekend. his death adding to the 2 homicide cases we were already investigating, with Barton Field's death still out there in iffy land. In the words of the boss, we had inherited the old bloke's demise, as it could be connected to the 2 estranged women's homicide deaths. It could be stressed by the boss to ensure we became the investigating team. That's all we needed, another homicide death to delve into. We filed slowly out of the boss's office after spending close to 3 hours discussing all the branch's cases, their problems and present positions, arrest protocols, court times, and who was allocated holiday time during the upcoming school holidays. I slumped into my desk chair, and swallowed the cool remains of coffee, dumping the empty container into a neighboring bin. 45 Where to from here, boss? The young Sophie asked as she spun her chair around to face me. I ground my teeth together, sure that she was never going to stop calling me boss. I'll have to learn to live with it. We stay away from the old bloke's bashing homicide for a bit, and concentrate on the 2 women's refuge homicides. They are connected in several ways. Both were residents of halfway houses, so both had come from violent marriages. We should check the records for further background material on their lives. They could have been randomly selected by our perp, with the refuges the common factor, not the women. We can assume our perp also came from a broken marriage, thus his anger at women's refuges, whom he thinks may have instilled anti-men sentiments into his ex's mind. Hang on, boss, you want to lay blame on women's refuges for anti-male sentiments, and didn't someone say the only stab wounds in both cases were carefully sighted and pushed down with a single effort? Hardly crimes of passion with anger mixed in for good measure. Yeah, well, most definitely, haven't you listened to women, and yes, men too, as they vent their spleen on their other half's fault in the marriage breakdown? It is universal when bad feelings are to the fore. I looked up at her, waiting for her to challenge my assumptions. She didn't, which in a way I was disappointed about, as I wanted her to challenge that theory. Okay, how can we word our search to find our perp? He comes from a broken marriage, no good, as almost 50% of marriages end in divorce. He cannot reconcile with being a divorcee. Is there any category we can search out with those facts as the basis? Hardly facts, Joe, Sophie muttered. Multiple arrests, where the perp is a divorced bloke, let's see. I slowly beat a tempo across the keyboard, hoping I was including enough keywords that would give a result. Look at this, will you? It goes back to early 20th century times, 1924, would you believe? There's a fair few incidents where the X, meaning males only, has multiple arrests, and where the woman's body has never been located. Back then it was extremely difficult to charge a bloke with a homicide murder of his ex-wife if there was no body. Just look at that Chris Dawson case. He's been found guilty of murdering his wife some 40 years ago, where the body of his ex-wife has never been found. The prosecution case was all based on 46 unsubstantiated evidence. It is surprising how many similar cases there are going back a century. That may be interesting, Joe, but that isn't what you were looking for. You're supposed to be looking for life histories on the 2 deceased women, and whether their husbands had done time, or where are they? What? Yeah, nah. I'm looking for a bloke who it is suspected may have killed his missus, with no body found, that has multiple arrests to his name. This search doesn't help much. Don't over-complicate your search, boss. Just do a search on both deceased women's ex-husbands, their histories, careers, and lives. Yeah. What? There's some interesting names on this list. While I had to admit this list was of no use to our cases, names dropped out that I had previous dealings with. Others jigged my memory of years ago. It was a good feeling to ride the memories down through the years. For no known reason to mankind, I googled Stanley Hunter to be surprised by an involved page on facts of Hunter's life. Why people did this I have no idea, unless they want to big mouth themselves and show they are above the PH lebs of this world. A skite I reckon which didn't go with the man we thought we knew. That was a little against the fellow we had a talk to the other week, the two did not gel. My thoughts were snapped into the present by a long burst of expletives from Sophie. Dracos Papadopoulos, he's a nasty piece of meat, bloody hell. What? Who in blazes is who? Papadopoulos. Our former husband of Roberta, or Bobby, as some wished to call her. Dracos has a fistful of charges against him, mostly for DV offences against his former wife Roberta. Did 3.5 for assault occasioning actual grievous bodily harm, out on parole after 2. What does our hot-headed Greek guy do? Tries to bash down his estranged wife's front door, which lands him back in prison for the remaining parole period. He was released 10 months ago, nothing since, but his history shows a man who has a short fuse, and a want to hit out, to strike anyone who annoys him. He has ownership problems, I reckon he is worth a visit. Hang on softs. Don T, get ahead of yourself. You say he has priors and has spent time in the clink, but those unidentified fingerprints at Barton Field's residential address did not place. 47 A red flag against his name. Dracos Papadopoulos has both his fingerprints and DNA on the criminal register because he has done time. There were no red flags against him with those fingerprints. Anyhow, why would he be in the picture in the homicide death of Fields? She scratched her scalp with a biro, as she looked absent-mindedly at me. Maybe. We know that many thought Barton Fields and Roberta Papadopoulos ni Karagiannis were made for one another in their teens going back to primary school days, until Stephanie Albright swept Fields off his feet. Roberta's parents were dead set on their number one daughter marrying a nice Greek lad. Entered Dracos Papadopoulos, who turned out to be a bad seed. I nodded, wanting softs to step outside that box. To extend her thoughts into a logical sequence of events. I liked it so far. I nodded, hoping that would be enough for her to continue. It was. Maybe. Sophie wagged a finger at me, something I despised. Maybe Roberta and Fields got together. What with Roberta's husband in prison, with it less than 0 of the two ever getting back together again once the sod is released from custody. When Steph and Fields separated, the two, Fields and Roberta, met up. The estranged husband Dracos follows his ex, not above his style regardless of the avo saying he was not to go anywhere close to his ex-wife. He sees Roberta and Fields together, which explodes his brain. He kills Fields thinking with him gone Roberta will be his again. Got news for you fellow, the girl is over you. She smiled, pleased with her assumption. I nodded, saying that it certainly clicked all the boxes. What tea about those unexplained fingerprints at Fields' abode? I asked, as though I was a tutor down Goulburn Way in the police academy. Sophie shook her head. To her everything fitted except for those bloody fingerprints. She looked over at me and again shook her head, pissed off at me, so I thought. 48. Chapter 20. Roberta Karagiannis. How do we track her down? I mean, she could have re-married, if she has, that stuffs up your theory of she and Fields connecting. Yeah, you're right. No, she hasn't married, instead being turned off by her first exercise into it. First thing, the Register General's to see 1, if she has divorced Papadopoulos, and 2, if she has remarried. Then a scroll through the NSW driver's license records to try and obtain an address for her either in her maiden name or her old papa's surname, and possibly a new married name, then cross-check that with the electoral roll. A visit to the tax office will give us a third collaboration of a home address. Hold on, we go to the tax office, and we'll need a court order. Let's go the simple way as you first suggested. I let her go as I wanted to contact Forensic Trace. I rang D.D. Simon's number, quoting the case number. Hang on, Joe, while I bring up the case on our computer. Yeah, got it. What do you want to know? Your report stated that there were unidentified fingerprints on Barton Field's computer, keyboard, mouse, and other areas. You didn't run them through the criminal fingerprint database. Why not? What for? It was a straight-out simple suicide case. It may have been back then when the body was first reported, but it has become a homicide investigation, with SOFs and I the lead detectives on the case. Oh. That makes one hell of a difference. Yeah, I remember. We'll have to visit the residence, treating our further examination as though it was a homicide case. Your people are already onto it. I interrupted. Oh. Okay. We fucked up not following through with SOP on Trace that we had. Sorry, it's our fault. I'll run those prints through the system and get back to you. Give me an hour, okay? 49. We didn't wait for her return ring, instead heading to an address at Granville, a spit away from our office. I knocked on the door that had a large 6 around a spile. I wondered why this was necessary, as a speakerphone and camera were located beside the entry door into the complex. Paranoia on the part of the tenants now residing at the apartment, I would imagine. After several knocks, a tired-sounding, scratchy voice sounded out of the speaker, as though nothing was going to faze this young woman. We identified ourselves and held out ID cards, first at the spile, and then at the camera associated with the speakerphone. Yeah, okay, what you want? Can we come in to ask a few questions instead of standing out here where half the other tenants can hear our conversation? We were on the 16th level of the apartment building. Yeah, hold on while I get some clothes on. We heard a cluck as the receiver was placed on its dock. There was silence for a good 5 minutes until we heard various locks being disengaged, with the door finally being swung slowly open. I'm Celeste O'Hara, how can I help you? She asked as she led us down a narrow hallway into a large living/dining/kitchen area. Views looking back at the Parramatta CBD skyline, which was constantly changing. Roberta Caragiani's, about time you cops paid attention to her, he'll kill her eventually if he is not stopped first. We're here investigating Barton Field's homicide. Barty, yeah, we heard, Bobby and he made the best couple. Bobby has been so upset when she heard she was off work for over a week. Her doctor prescribed sleeping tablets and anxiety blockers. She's back at work this week. I looked around the flat. Sparkling clean and everything in its place, as though a Vogue photographer was expected any minute. Bric-a-brac and large wall murals of animals on every spare wall. A faint cat smell and the chirping of a canary in a cage out on the balcony. 50. So, Roberta lives here. There's 4 of us sharing the joint, otherwise we couldn't afford the stupendously high rent. It's reasonable with the 4 of us putting in equal shares. Bobby? She's in Westmead Hospital. That crud of an ex gave her another hiding